Good evening. Welcome to Chartwell Booksellers. My name's Barry Singer, and I'm the proprietor of Chartwell Booksellers. Every Churchill book that arrives, newly published, is an occasion. We've seen many of them over 35 years of business, but this is a special occasion for a very special biography, an extraordinary feat of biography. And we're very proud to be debuting it here because the book, I think, officially comes out today in the United States. It is already out in Great Britain, where it has entered the top 10 bestseller list, and where the Sunday Times has already called it the best biography ever written about Winston Churchill. Andrew Roberts first came to my attention with his book Eminent Churchillians around the time that we opened the store. I've read all of his books as they have come out since then, and they've all been wonders of writing skill and biographic craft. His Napoleon biography is also quite likely definitive. I also have to say in Andrew's behalf that of all the authors of Churchill books over all the years, Andrew has actually been a customer as well, and a really good one. And I don't take that for granted. I'm delighted to welcome him here this evening on this very special occasion for this very special biography of Winston Churchill. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much indeed, Barry, for those kind words. I'd like to take you back to the afternoon, the evening, about 6 o'clock in the evening of Friday the 10th of May 1940, when Winston Churchill kissed hands as Prime Minister and at an audience with King George VI took over the reins of the British government. Earlier that morning, of course, Adolf Hitler had unleashed blitzkrieg on the West, invading Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland. And so it was that very same day that he became Prime Minister. And he very famously wrote in the last paragraph of the first of his war memoirs, the first volume of his war memoirs, The Gathering Storm, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." And what I've tried to do in this book is to unpack that, to investigate that, to look into that more carefully. To what extent is it true that Churchill's past life, the various jobs that he'd held, like Chancellor of the Exchequer, twice, of course, he'd been First Lord of the Admiralty, like Home Secretary and so on, how much, and Minister of Munitions, where he had been in charge of 2.5 million people working in the munitions factories of the First World War, how much was that genuinely a preparation for his hour and for his trial in May 1940? And the other part of the beginning part of that sentence also I wanted to look at very carefully, this concept of him walking with destiny, because it strikes me that Churchill's sense of a personal destiny is tremendously important to him. He did believe that he was specifically destined to save Britain and save London, save the Empire. When he was a 16-year-old schoolboy at Harrow School, Churchill was almost entirely self-educated, owing to the fact that he had to be because he went to Harrow. He was able to say to his best friend, a boy called Merland Evans, that I can see great and terrible struggles awaiting. He said, there will be great upheavals in my life, and I will be called upon to save London and save the country and save the empire. Now, he said this, ladies and gentlemen, at the age of 16 years old, so it was a full half-century before this extraordinary act of self-prophecy finally, in fact, came to fruition. But nonetheless, his belief in himself, in that this great destiny of his, was undimmed over all the years that intervened. And in fact, the number of close brushes with death that he experienced in his life only reinforced this sense of destiny, because he believed that over him, as he called them, beat invisible wings, keeping an eye open to protect him so that he was going to be able to fulfill his destiny. At the age of 10, only 10 years old, he was stabbed in the stomach by a penknife by a fellow pupil at school, at his prep school. The following year, he nearly died of pneumonia, and the doctors administered brandy to him at the age of 11, both orally and rectally. You might have thought, ladies and gentlemen, that that would put you off brandy for life, but in Winston Churchill's case, it clearly didn't. He then survived a house fire. He survived a near drowning on Lake Geneva. He survived 2 plane crashes, 3 car crashes. Very nearly, of course, he died here on Fifth Avenue and 76th Street. In fact, on the front cover of this book, the English version of this book, which you can also see on the American version, you can see this scar down the center of his forehead, which came as a result of that terrible crash, which he so nearly died. It went bright red when he had arguments with the chiefs of staff during the Second World War. One of the things that came as a result of his sense of personal destiny is that he was incredibly calm in moments of crises. Terrible crises, the worst perilous moments that were ever to overcome my country, saw Winston Churchill immensely calm because he always knew that he was going to save London and the country and the empire. During the confidence motion in 1942, when it was pointed out when theoretically at least, his whole government might have been in danger, and it was pointed out how bad the A-22 tank was, he said that when the defects and the teething troubles of the A-22 tank became apparent to all, it was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. And the key line in that joke, of course, is the word appropriately, because he understood that he had teething troubles and defects himself, very serious ones. He'd got women's suffrage wrong, he'd got the abdication crisis wrong, he'd got the gold standard wrong, and most seriously, of course, he had got the Dardanelles campaign wrong. It was a brilliant idea, absolutely fantastic strategic act of genius if they had managed to get the Royal Navy through the Dardanelles Straits and then to have knocked the Ottoman Empire out of the Central Powers, it would have been an almost war-winning stroke. But of course, in the implementation of the plan on the 18th of March 1915, it fell desperately down, and the Allies lost 6 ships in the course of that day. And then, of course, he took it on the next month to attack on the 25th of April 1915, and they got bogged down in that long campaign, which eventually was to cost 160,000 Allied killed and wounded. So I'm not in any way suggesting that Winston Churchill got everything right. He didn't. He was a genius, but he was a flawed genius. But the great thing about him is that he was one of those politicians who was capable of learning from his mistakes. And the great mistake of the Dardanelles was learnt from by him, and he never once in the Second World War overruled the chiefs of staff when all 3 of the chiefs of staff agreed on a plan or a point of principle. Never once overruled them, even though constitutionally, of course, he could have as Minister of Defence and Prime Minister. You have, therefore, this man who believed that the Almighty was looking after him. Winston Churchill was not a Christian. He never mentioned the word Jesus Christ in the 5.2 million words that he spoke or the 6.1 million words that he wrote. But he did believe in an Almighty. But when you look carefully, theologically, at the duties of the Almighty, they seem to have consisted really solely in taking care of Winston Churchill. I'm often asked why, if there are 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill, I should bother to write a 1,010th. Beyond, obviously, keeping Barry in business. We've all got to carry on writing biographies to keep Barry in business. But beyond that, really, what's the point of a 1,010th? And the answer is that in the last 10 years, there has been a cornucopia of new sources about Winston Churchill that have come out. it's quite extraordinary that so many important news sources haven't come up until now. I was very fortunate to be asked to be allowed by Her Majesty the Queen to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And of course, King George VI saw Winston Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War. They met at Buckingham Palace at the audience, and they served themselves from the sideboard so that the incredibly secret things that they discussed weren't overheard by any servants. The Prime Minister trusted the King with all of the great secrets of the war, including the nuclear secret, the ultra-decrypt secret, where they were going to attack and when they were going to attack, and who the ministers and generals were who were going to be hired and fired. It wasn't, of course, taken for granted that they were going to get on so well, these two men. Churchill had, of course, supported Edward VIII, the King's elder brother, at the time of the abdication crisis. And also, the King had been a very big supporter of Neville Chamberlain and his policy of appeasement. So it wasn't automatically taken for granted that they would, but they did get on immediately, especially even by the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, certainly by the Blitz. The King was referring in his diaries to Churchill as his friend, and he was the only one of the 4 prime ministers of King George VI who was referred to by his first name. And it was very fortunate that they did get on, because they were able to trust each other perfectly. You also, as well as his wonderful diaries, have the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43. You have the love letters of Pamela Harriman, very racy. She had an extremely active romantic life during the Second World War, and of course was married to Randolph Churchill, Winston's son. You have the verbatim accounts now of the cabinet war minutes, and also you have no fewer than 41 sets of papers, 41 sets of papers that have been deposited by people who worked with Churchill, deposited at the Churchill College archives in Cambridge University, which is a wonderful resource for anybody. So there is a space. In fact, there's virtually every single page of this book has got quotations that will never have been seen in any biography of Winston Churchill before. And what do they tell us, all of these new sources, and indeed the old ones? Well, they tell us that Winston Churchill was an extraordinarily emotional man. He was driven by his passions to a degree that very few other Victorian-era politicians were. He burst into tears, for example, on no fewer than 50 occasions during the Second World War. Must have been very off-putting in the House of Commons to have seen the Prime Minister burst into tears. I'm not sure how we would feel if Theresa May were suddenly to burst it. She's got every right to, I hasten to add, but if she was suddenly to just burst into tears in the House of Commons. But the reason for this, for Churchill's emotionalism, was that he was not the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat of his age and class and background at all. He was in fact a throwback, I see, as to an earlier era. He was a romantic Regency figure from the 19th century, early 19th century. Somebody who didn't mind wearing his heart on his sleeve. I don't believe that he was a depressive. He got depressed, undoubtedly. He got depressed at moments like the fall of Singapore in February 1942 and the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, and of course during the Dardanelles. But that's a far cry from being a depressive who becomes depressed as a result of a medical and chemical imbalance. He wasn't one of those people any more than he was a manic depressive or I've seen in some books bipolar. The fact is that depression is a debilitating illness, a terrible and debilitating illness, and Churchill chaired 1,000 committees, 1,000 meetings of the War Cabinet Defence Committee, which is something at all times of day and night, all the way through the war, which he couldn't have done had he been a depressive or a manic depressive. Neither, in fact, was he an alcoholic. He did drink an enormous amount, there's no doubt about that. In fact, C.P. Scott, the journalist C.P. Scott, said that Winston Churchill couldn't be an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And I agree with him. He was, I agree with his own sense. He had this ox-like constitution. He did drink a lot. He liked to boast about how much he drank. He said that he could drink Stalin under the table, for example. But actually, when you look at his drinking, he kept his blood alcohol level at a pretty straight level all the way through the war. And there's only one occasion, the Second World War was 2,194 days long. There's only one occasion in that whole period when he was very clearly, and everybody noticed that he was drunk. And on that occasion, they just pretended it hadn't happened and held the meeting again the next morning when everyone was clear-headed. And so no decisions were taken as a result of Winston Churchill getting drunk. It's very important, though, to go back to that point that he was somebody who learnt from his mistakes. And he told his wife, Clementine, that he would have made nothing if he had not made mistakes. His father was a tremendously powerful influence on him, of course, his proud, disdainful, mercurial, brilliant father, who never really understood Churchill, never appreciated him, never showed him the kind of affection that this young boy deserved. And so for the rest of his life, Churchill was, in a sense, attempting to appeal to and to impress the shade of his long-dead father. His father, of course, died in 1895, aged 45, when Churchill was only 20 years old. And in that sense, it's a tremendously sad story. His mother also, we have the beautiful, gorgeous Jenny Jerome, born, of course, in Brooklyn, and who took virtually no interest in him whatsoever until he was old enough to become a signatory on her trust fund, at which point he certainly did start to take interest in her. But up until then, as he obviously wrote in the My Early Life, his autobiography, she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance. And one can see in her diaries, her 1884 diaries, when Winston Churchill was only 10 years old, that she only managed to find about 6.5 hours to see him in the 6 months of first 6 months of 1884, when he was 10 years old. He, of course, was broke almost all his life, a result of having spent very much more than he earned. He never believed in cutting back. There was one occasion when he wrote to Clementine to say no more champagne at Chartwell, and that lasted all of 3 days. Otherwise, he always believed that the best way of dealing with being short of money, and he was short of money in part because he employed 14 servants at Chartwell, was to earn more. And that's the reason that we have the 36 books that he wrote and the hundreds of articles that he wrote, all of which, of course, are for sale here at Chartwell Books. And if we had he been better off, we wouldn't have had these fantastic works of literature that really do bear rereading immediately after you finish my book. One of the things that happened as a result of Churchill being permanently broke is that when he wrote an article which he couldn't use, he would do what, or at least an editor wouldn't accept, he would do what a lot of journalists do, which is to just keep the article in a drawer for better days. And of course, when he became Prime Minister, all editors were willing to publish anything that he wrote. And so he brought out these old articles from the 1930s and sold them for the equivalent of £26,000 per article. And that's the reason why you get an extraordinary thing on the 7th of March 1942, where Churchill, and it's a terrible time for the Allies in 1942. The Japanese have taken 1/8 of the planet. The British are on retreat in the North African littoral. The Russians are on retreat against the Nazis in Russia. It's a bad time. And that is the time that the Prime Minister brings out and publishes an article in the Sunday Dispatch entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" And he concludes in this article that there are probably men on the moon, there are certainly aliens, and there are bound to be UFOs as well. Again, ladies and gentlemen, can you imagine if Theresa May were to publish an article entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" concluding that, yes, indeed, there were. One of the things that struck me most powerfully during the course of writing this book, and this is the 5th book that I've written with Churchill in the title or the subtitle, is and therefore I feel with regard to writing this book that all my past life has been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial, is the extraordinary courage, physical courage that he showed. When he took part in the charge of the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman in September 1898, there were no fewer than 25% of his unit were casualties in that attack. The following year, in the great train ambush in South Africa in 1899, it was 34% of his unit who were killed and wounded at that time. And you find, and of course the following year he escaped from the prisoner of war camp and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory. Extraordinarily brave thing to do, but it continued on into the Second World War. And in fact, in the end papers of the British edition of this book, you can see all the places that he, in the front there, all the places he crossed the Atlantic and went westwards. And then in the back of the book, all of the places that he went in the other direction, to Cairo and to Tehran and to Moscow. In all, he travelled 110,000 miles outside the United Kingdom as Prime Minister during the Second World War. He did it very largely either crossing in ships across the U-boat-infested Atlantic, or he went in planes, unpressurized cabins, of course, freezing cold in his late 60s and early 70s, and very often within the radius of the Luftwaffe. And he did it on one of his flights across the Atlantic. His plane was struck by lightning, and they feared that the instrumentation would go down, in which case he'd have been a goner. And so you have this tremendous bravery on top of course, going to watch battles, on top of going up onto the Air Ministry roof in the Blitz, and also, of course, he had a heart attack, minor heart attack, when he was in the White House in December 1941, and he had a series of strokes of pneumonia as well, and nearly died from 2 of those during the Second World War. There's a moment in May 1943 where his doctor came to him asking for a blood sample during one of his pneumonia attacks, and Churchill said, "Well, yes, you can take some blood from my ear or from my finger, and I also have an almost infinite expanse of arse." The reasons, I think, that Winston Churchill was able to be the first of and the foremost of all of the prime ministers who, first and foremost of all of the British politicians, and indeed for much of the 1930s, the only politician who was able to see Hitler and the Nazis for what they were, I think break down into 3 great categories. The first, of course, was that he was a Philo-Semite. He liked Jews, he went on holiday with Jews, he grew up with Jews, his father liked Jews, he believed that the Jews gave the ethics for Western civilization, and he felt comfortable in their company, and he represented a Jewish constituency in Manchester Northwest as a young man. He was a Zionist. He had, of course, signed the Balfour Declaration, or not signed it, but he'd supported the Balfour Declaration. And this gave him, I think, an early warning system that was denied to many of the anti-Semites who were on the back benches and indeed the front benches of the Conservative Party and indeed other political parties at the time. So that was one of the reasons he was able to spot the Nazis for what they were so early. Another was that he was an historian, and he recognized that Hitler's attempts to hegemonize Europe fell very much in the great continuum of threats to the United Kingdom, and ones that, just as so many of the earlier threats had been defeated, that this one needed to be defeated too. He was able to see it, therefore, in its historical context, a context of Philip II of Spain and the Armada, his own great ancestor, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, being able to stop in the wars of Spanish succession, Louis XIV trying to take over the continent, then Napoleon, then the Kaiser, and of course he himself, today being Veterans Day and the day after the commemoration of the centenary of the end of the Great War, we should remember Winston Churchill going off into no man's land as the battalion commander of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers 30 times during the First World War, getting so close to the enemy trenches that he could actually hear the Germans speaking in their trenches. And so the Kaiser, of course, was another person who had attempted to hegemonize Europe, and he saw Hitler in his proper historical context. He was also able to see Hitler and the Nazis for the fanatics that they were, because he had seen fanaticism up close himself. He'd seen it on the northwest frontier, he'd seen it in the Sudan, he had, in both cases, of course, religious fanaticism, but also in both cases he was able to see the kind of people that Hitler and the Nazis were in a way that Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain never were able to. So you have, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, a man with great foresight in the Second World War, after the Second World War as much as before it, in his great Iron Curtain speech in May 1946 when he warned against Stalin and Soviet communism. That showed just as much foresight as it did beforehand, before the Second World War. A man who made terrible mistakes but managed to learn from them, and a man who was tremendously eloquent. He worked incredibly hard on his speeches. He wasn't just by luck the greatest, in my view at least, the greatest orator of the 20th century. He was somebody who put enormous amount of practice into his public speaking, and spending hours and hours practicing these speeches. He wrote all his own speeches. He never employed a spin doctor. He never listened to a focus group. He was somebody who, when he spoke, you knew it came from him. And that, I think, also is a tremendously important aspect of Churchill. And part of his eloquence came from, as he said, as he told a friend during the Second World War, came from his belief in using short words, short sentences, concentrating on clarity, and also concentrating on, whenever he could, using words from Old English. And you see this in particular in the peroration of his great speech that we shall fight on the beaches of June 1940, where he talks about fighting with growing confidence in the air, and ending, of course, in the peroration, we shall never surrender. If you look at those 141 words of that last paragraph, you see that all but 2 of them come from Old English. Those 2 being the word confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to enjoy that one. Thank you. So you have, therefore, a man who has insight, who has clarity of vision, who has foresight, who has the physical courage and the moral courage to go out there and say what he believes, and also has the eloquence to put it in words that will live as long as the English language and the English tongue survive. And those have got to be the great values. And as he said of courage, courage is rightly esteemed the greatest of all the virtues because it guarantees all the others. And when you have all of those in one person, you have somebody who was able to do even better than he had predicted for himself and prophesied for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy, because he didn't just save London and his country and the empire. He actually also managed to save civilization itself. Thank you very much. Now, we've got a bit of time before you all rush off to buy my book back there. We have a few minutes for questions, don't we?
I just want to say we have a microphone for the questions. If you just wait for the microphone.
Can't thank you enough. Greatly appreciated. Would you mind sharing with us how you wrote this book, your own journey, did you have any help? How long did it take? Where did you actually work? Is that possible?
Yes, of course. I'd be delighted to. I'm happy you're interested. I certainly didn't have any help. I've never employed a research assistant in my life. I have no intention ever of doing that. This is all my own work, and I feel. I rather fear the use of research assistants because one is always worried that they will have plagiarized whoever they're researching, and therefore you would plagiarize them and you would wind up being accused of plagiarizing whoever it was that they were working on. So it's far too risky, in my view, to use research assistants. As far as where I work in my study at home. It has a little over 1,000 books on Winston Churchill all over the walls, piled up under the desk. It's absolutely everywhere on all of the windowsills and you name it. So actually, once I finally manage to put this book behind me, I'm going to have an almost empty study, which my wife is very much looking forward to seeing. My own working times are rather strange. I get all my information together, all the evidence together before I write a word. I'm not one of these people who can write in bits after having gone off to a research place and then bring it all together at the end. I have to, in order for me to feel that I have an overarching theme and to know where the themes fit into each of the chapters, I need to have got everything together before I write a word. And so as a result, I get up. This book took me 4 years to do the research. In a sense, 30 years, of course, because I've been writing about Churchill for 30 years. But 4 years to do the research, and then I wrote the entire book in 100 days, averaging 5,500 words a day. Every day. I start at 4 o'clock in the morning, and something else my wife doesn't like very much, and I go through, and then in the afternoon I drink a disgusting drink called Red Bull, which keeps me awake all afternoon, shaking like this, and it means that I can get the number of words done. So in 100 days, little over 3 months, it was all done, and I was able to send it off to the publishers. Sir. Oh, sorry, no, this gentleman and then the gentleman behind you.
Thank you very much. In your BBC, I think it was Radio 4, you had a 5-part series on Churchill's passions. I think they were his sense of destiny, his father's friendships, his emotion, and his wit. I was wondering if any one of those, or perhaps another source, what was behind his remarkable energy, his exuberance, his enthusiasm, his joy. Thank you.
Yes, a very good question. He was quite the most energetic. I thought Napoleon was the most energetic person that I'd ever come across in my studies, but actually Churchill is even more energetic. He only took 8 days holiday during the whole of the Second World War, and in fact he worked on 2 of those days. His energy sprung from the fact, as he himself wrote in his book Painting as a Pastime, from the fact that he loved what he did. He absolutely adored politics, he loved writing, he loved journalism and history. He bounced out of bed in the morning, rubbing his hands with glee at the idea of having a day that he was going to be able to fill with his bricklaying or his painting or whatever it was that he was going to be doing that day. He was also a huge multitasker. He was able to dictate while having a bath, have the papers read to him whilst he was sitting up in bed answering telegrams and so on. He also extended his day, of course, by having a nap every afternoon, and he found that the 45 minutes to an hour that he spent asleep actually extended his day by 2 hours, which annoyed lots of his staff because, of course, they couldn't take naps in the afternoon in the same way that he did. But no, there was a joie de vivre about him which was completely infectious. Gentleman there.
So there were many times in Churchill's life when he was very hard up for money. But there always seemed to be somebody to come along to rescue him, including the American financier Bernard Baruch. So why were these men these wealthy men so willing to put up money to save Churchill financially? Was it because, do you think, that they saw the greatness in him, or were there other reasons?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Bernard Baruch is a good example of that. He covered his losses at the time of the Great Crash. And Churchill made terrible losses. He lost the equivalent of £500,000 in today's money on the one day of the Great Crash in October 1929. He also had a great friend in Sir Henry Strakoch, an industrialist who also picked up his losses. And then, of course, in 1941, another great friend of his, Sir A. Bailey, died and left him the equivalent of £1 million in his will. Now, the former historian David Irving points out that some of these people who helped Churchill out were Jewish, and therefore he implies that there was a sort of conspiracy going on, that they were financing Churchill simply because Churchill was a Philo-Semite and Zionist. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that whatsoever. And in fact, when Irving also claims that Jews were doing this in order to advance their own personal interests, I think that that's comprehensively exploded by the fact that Sir A. Bailey gave his money in his will. So therefore his own personal interests were hardly likely to be advanced by that. It was exactly as you mentioned. These people admired Churchill. They saw him as somebody who was going to be taking on and fighting the Nazis. He was almost the only person in the 1930s who did have this foresight. And so when it looked like on two occasions Chartwell Manor, his great beautiful house in Kent, needed to go up for sale, or if he had in fact been declared bankrupt, he would have had to have left the House of Commons, which would have been a complete disaster for the anti-appeasement struggle. These various generous and rich men stepped forward. But it wasn't just Jews. When in 1948 he needed to sell Chartwell, it was a group of his closest friends, some of them were Jewish, but the great majority weren't, who stepped forward and bought Chartwell for him. So this was a man who, as I think the earlier questioner mentioned, his friendship, his capacity for friendship. One of the BBC shows that I made about this concept of the capacity for friendship, you see it in the membership of the Other Club, which was founded in 1911 amongst Churchill's friends, is something that is one of the most attractive features about Churchill's personality. He had a capacity for friendship. He stuck by friends even when they, indeed especially when they had bad times come to them. And so when on the 7th and 8th of May 1940, during the Norway debate, the 7 major speeches that were made to bring down the Chamberlain government, which of course led to Churchill's premiership, no fewer than 6 of them came from members of the Other Club, who therefore were long-standing friends, sometimes for 30 years, of Winston Churchill's.
My question is about Lord Halifax. In your sympathetic biography of him, you suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, that the approaches to Italy and so forth in the spring of 1940 were at least reasonable. Have your views changed at all, or?
I don't think I thought that they were reasonable. I think that Lord Halifax thought that they were reasonable. No, in retrospect, of course, they would have been completely disastrous. If we'd made peace or gone down that route at all in 1940, and I do say this in my book, The Holy Fox, it would have been demoralizing if that fact had become known. And if we'd actually made peace with Hitler in 1940, it would have been absolutely disastrous for Britain, and also ultimately, I think, also for the United States and the rest of civilization. not least because Hitler would have been able to have used the whole of the Luftwaffe in his attack on Russia. As it was, he only used 50 to 70% of it because he had to keep the rest of it back to protect against our bombing raids from the RAF. If he had managed to use the whole of the the Luftwaffe in his attack on Leningrad, which he subjected, of course, to a 1,000-day-long grueling siege. He got to the subway stations of Moscow. He captured Stalingrad. He could well have pushed the Russians beyond the Urals, and that would have been something that would have been utterly disastrous for Britain in the long term. So, no, Lord Halifax's attempts to explore peace were in many ways, Churchill preventing that, stopping that, was a greater act than anything else he did in the Second World War, in my view. You'll get it all in, all of this is covered in chapter 20 of this book. Very important. It's an absolutely key, pivotal moment of the history of the 20th century, in my view.
So I know there's conflicting opinions about this, but what was his view on a united Europe, a European Union, and how would he go about the Brexit negotiations?
Owing to the fact that he died half a century before the Brexit referendum, I think that I'm going to be allowed off the second of those questions. However, with regard to his views on Europe, he very much was in favour of Europe uniting. He was the major figure behind the European movement. He was the person who said at the Zurich conference, let Europe unite. He didn't want, as he put it, Teuton ever again to fight Gaul. And so in the Zurich speech and various other speeches, the Hague speech, the Strasbourg speech, he did want Europe to come together. However, it's pretty clear from all of those speeches that he didn't want the United Kingdom to be part of it. And so he, and you can see in his peacetime premiership between October 1951 and April 1955, that he made no movements towards, and this was just prior, of course, to the Treaty of Rome, where the common market was set up. He made absolutely no movements towards joining the Iron and Steel Trade Confederation or the European Army or any of the groups that you'd have had to have joined in order to have been part of the Treaty of Rome. So you have to really choose between his public statements in favour of European unity, but without Britain being a member, and his actual actions as well, on top of that, in which he made sure that Britain didn't go any closer to joining the economic community. But he was very much in favour of all of the rest of Europe uniting in order to prevent another war.
Just a question about his family. Did you get any insight into the support, Clementine, his children, any different interpretations?
Yes, well, not different interpretations, but much deeper interpretation, really. His daughter Mary Soames's wartime diaries are very moving. Actually, they are the story of a 18 and 19-year-old girl who is desperately in love with her father, who worships him, who quotes him admiringly and jokingly on occasion, but obviously admires him so much for what he's doing for the country in 1940 and 41. And there are quotations from it here that therefore will not have appeared in any other book on Winston Churchill before, as with so many of these new sources. But overall, it's a sad story, of course. Randolph Churchill was a terrible drunk, really from Oxford onwards. He couldn't, with Winston Churchill, as Churchill said, alcohol is my servant and not my master. And he also said that he'd taken more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken out of him. Well, I'm afraid this was not true of Randolph, who was a hopeless drunk on many occasions. And also, one of his daughters committed suicide, and another one also became an alcoholic. So, although he loved his family very much, Mary, of course, was a wonderful lady, and there's no nothing against her, but nonetheless, it's a very difficult thing to be the child of a great man. You know, it's a well-known phenomenon. Although he himself was the son of a great man in Lord Randolph Churchill, so he himself was somebody who was able to get beyond that famous problem.
What, if any, relationship did Churchill have with David Ben-Gurion in the years 45 to 47 before Israel was founded?
He was, as you know, a great supporter of Israel, of the concept of Israel. He was a supporter of the Balfour Declaration. He of course also denounced very aggressively the Stern Gang and Irgun and the organisation that killed his friend Lord Moyne. He was close to Chaim Weizmann and admired Weizmann enormously, and he welcomed the creation of the State of Israel. I think had he won the 1945 general election, you wouldn't have had the kind of ill-tempered transfer of power that you got in 1948. You certainly wouldn't have got the anti-Semitic Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary, causing as much trouble as he did at the time of that. Equally, he was exhausted by 1945. He wasn't about to. Maybe losing that election was to save his life, because he was completely played out by that time. Sir.
Thank you. You mentioned that he was the son of a great man, and this brings something to my mind. Do you think it affected him somehow and made him, gave him a greater impetus to become a great man, that his father died so young when he himself was just barely 20?
Yes, it's a continuing factor in his life. This attempt, as I think I mentioned in the speech, to impress the shade of his dead father. He talked about his father endlessly. He wrote his father's biography. He sought out his father's friends. He adopted his father's political stance. He called his son Randolph. It was his father. And then in 1947, he had this weird psychological moment where he actually believed he had met the ghost of his father, and he wrote about that in a book called The Dream, a short story called The Dream. And at no point in that meeting of his father did he tell his father that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. So his father, the ghost, goes away still thinking that his son was merely a painter rather than a great statesman, and a greater statesman than he himself, the father, had ever been.
He was also the son of a great woman, one might say. Any comments about that relationship?
Yes, it mattered to him enormously that she had effectively ignored him as he grew up, had spent so little time, only 6.5 hours in 6 months in 1884. And yet he, rather like his father, he didn't let it grate on him. He didn't get psychologically affected by his mother's lack of interest in him, and they became friends, almost like brother and sister friends, when later in life he and she had to work out the family finances, owing to the fact that they were both magnificent spenders, especially his mother. And so it became something of a friendship. And then he was affected when she died very young as a result of falling downstairs and her breaking her ankle and it being going gangrenous and her very suddenly dying.
Would it be fair for history to judge Churchill as believing that the British race was superior? And if so, how might that impact our evaluation of of him and some of his policies.
Yes, he very much did believe that. He was, of course, 10 years old. He was at school at the time that Charles Darwin was still alive. So people did, however ludicrous and obscene it might be to today's mind, of course, people did believe in a hierarchy of the races. It was considered to be scientific fact. And it was something that he certainly did believe in. It was pretty central, of course, to his being a imperialist and his belief in the British Empire, which is something that he dedicated himself to. He was a paternalist imperialist. He wanted to bring up the what he saw as the native peoples in the British Empire as much as he could. He wasn't the sort of exterminationist imperialist of the Adolf Hitler kind by any means. But yes, a belief that not only the British were superior to other non-whites, but he also believed that the British were superior to Germans, for example. And that was a belief that was absolutely central in 1940. And he told the French Prime Minister in June 1940 that he believed that that the British people would, because of their innate toughness and their courage, would be able to see through the Second World War and win it. And frankly, although today, of course, we despise such what we would call racism, at the time it was jolly useful that the Prime Minister had such a intense belief in the capabilities of the British people. Sir.
As you mentioned, Churchill was a very emotional man, and I find it interesting that both Hitler and Churchill were soldiers, foot soldiers in World War I. It seems to me that Hitler developed more of a hatred for the Allied forces than Churchill did towards the Germans. So was he able to compartmentalize this better and be more clinical with his decisions?
Actually, funnily enough, that's a good question, but funnily enough, the British Army didn't hate the Germans at all, and they, if anything, there was a sort of live and let live attitude when they weren't actually fighting full scale against each other. It was not a war of hatred on the British side. It's almost remarkable, actually, how little hatred there was in the Great War. But you're right about Adolf Hitler's stance as a result. He did come with a profound loathing, learnt a profound loathing of the French, the Americans, and the British as a result of his wartime experiences. Although he won the Iron Cross in the First World War, Iron Cross First Class, actually, if you look at the latest books on Hitler's First World War experiences as a regimental runner, pretty much all of the regimental runners got the Iron Cross First Class. It was handed out to all of them. And he was not running whilst the shells were falling. He was running to and from the front line when the shells weren't falling, in fact. And it wasn't, the Iron Cross also wasn't quite like the Victoria Cross. It was much more like the military medal. And so I think quite a lot has been made about Hitler's First World War experiences and how supposedly brave he was. He really wasn't any braver than pretty much everybody else in his unit. Whereas Churchill, went into no man's land when he didn't have to on 30 occasions, which was really, truly remarkably brave. So.
Thank you for the nice talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I have a question. If we find ourselves, the world that is in a very dangerous situation, such as World War II, do you think we have a leader such as Churchill who would have foresight, or we're devoid of that at the moment?
Well, what you have to remember is that you have to get into the war beforehand, because Winston Churchill would not have become Prime Minister under any other circumstance except for a world war. Indeed, except for a world war that we weren't even winning. That is a key prerequisite to Churchill becoming Prime Minister. You'll see from chapters 19 and 20 of this book quite how much had to happen for the Conservative Party to put up with Churchill, let alone choose him. They didn't choose him. He was chosen by a group of 4 people, himself included. And under almost any other circumstance, he would not have been Prime Minister. So the World War is a prerequisite for him coming to the fore. And if you look at British politics and history, actually it's very much the case that Prime Ministers do come to the fore during the wars. Wars are very rarely ended by the same Prime Minister who started them. Lord Palmerston, of course, took over from Lord Aberdeen during the Crimean War. Lloyd George took over from Herbert Asquith during the Great War. Churchill took over from Neville Chamberlain. So we do have a history, really, of getting wars badly wrong at the beginning and then having somebody else come in and clean up the mess later on. Sir, last question. And can we make this maybe the last question, and then I'd be very happy to come and sign a few books for anybody who'd be interested in getting one.
It seems that over time the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt deteriorated. Did Churchill disappointed in that? Did he comment on it very often? What was his reaction?
Yes, the question for anybody who didn't hear it at the back was about the relationship between Churchill and FDR. It was a proper friendship. It was something that worked incredibly well, especially in 1940 and 41. Churchill admired Roosevelt very much. They of course were both aristocrats in their own countries. They were people who were on the left of their political spectrums and saw common cause in a lot of that. And also they agreed on the Germany First policy, which was the great prerequisite, really, for seeing eye to eye strategically. But I think it's fair to say that by the fall of 1944, Churchill and Roosevelt no longer saw eye to eye strategically, and on a number of other post-war issues as well. So by the time of Roosevelt's death in April 1945, the relationship had really broken down. There are 372 more letters from Churchill to Roosevelt than there are replies from Roosevelt to Churchill, which is a sign of quite how much the relationship had broken down. And so, although there was still a personal friendship, and they were able to get on and make jokes and all the rest of it, actually, when it came to policy, the kind of closeness that they had by that stage had broken down. But that didn't mean that when Churchill said goodbye to Roosevelt after the Yalta Conference, when they were in Alexandria and said goodbye for the last time. And of course, by that stage, Churchill saw that Roosevelt was frail and not necessarily dying, but although it turned out that, of course, he was. Churchill was deeply affected on their final goodbye because he suspected that it was indeed going to be a final goodbye. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleasure. That was wonderful. So you have some time. Yes. We have some time to spend with Andrew at the shop, I'm delighted to say, so please join us, and we'll continue. Thank you for coming.